There are moments when distance feels completely different from separation. At first, the eye sees distance everywhere, the mountains rising beyond the water, the peaks fading softly into the horizon, the shoreline resting quietly between stone, grass, and sky. Everything appears spread apart. Everything seems to occupy its own place. Yet the longer the moment remains, the less separate everything begins to feel. The water does not argue with the mountains. The mountains do not compete with the sky. The sky does not try to become larger than the landscape beneath it. Everything exists together. Nothing asks to stand apart. The lake moves softly beneath the light. Small ripples cross the surface without urgency. They travel nowhere important. They arrive nowhere important. They simply continue. The sunlight settles gently across the water. Tiny reflections appear and disappear, not as events, not as interruptions, simply as part of the same quiet movement already taking place. The mind notices this. At first, it may still be busy. A thought appears, a memory, something unfinished waiting somewhere beyond the moment, something connected to tomorrow, something connected to yesterday. The familiar movement begins, the urge to follow, the urge to continue, the urge to turn one thought into another. But the landscape offers no encouragement. Nothing here seems interested in continuing the story. The water continues. The mountains remain. The sky rests above everything. The thought lingers briefly, then fades. Not because it is pushed away, not because it is unwanted, simply because it no longer feels necessary. The moment remains complete without it. Breathing continues quietly. The body remains still. Nothing asks for attention. Nothing demands a response. Even the distance across the lake begins to feel different. At first, it seemed wide. Something stretched between here and there. But gradually, the distance loses its meaning. The water belongs to the mountains. The mountains belong to the sky. The sky belongs to the moment. Nothing feels disconnected. Nothing feels isolated. Everything participates in the same quiet presence. The ripples continue moving across the surface, each one different, each one familiar. None of them remain. None of them need to remain. The lake does not try to hold them. The water allows each movement to arrive and disappear naturally. The mind begins to notice something within this. Thoughts behave much the same way. A memory arrives, then fades. A concern appears, then softens. A question forms, then disappears. The mind often treats these movements as important, as permanent, as something that must be followed. But here beside the water, they begin to resemble ripples, temporary, natural, part of a larger stillness. The mountains remain unchanged, snow resting quietly along distant ridges, sharp edges softened by distance, ancient shapes standing beyond measurement. They ask for nothing. They explain nothing. They simply remain. There is comfort in this, not because the mountains provide answers, because they do not. The landscape offers no solution, no lesson, no instruction, only presence. And perhaps presence is enough. The sunlight shifts almost invisibly. The reflections across the water change. The colors soften. The shadows deepen. Yet nothing feels lost. Nothing feels gained. Everything simply continues. The mind begins to slow further, not through effort, not through concentration, because there is less reason to hurry. Nothing in the landscape is rushing. Nothing is preparing for another moment. Nothing is trying to become more complete. Everything already belongs exactly where it is. The water does not wish to become the mountains. The mountains do not wish to become the sky. The sky does not wish to become something else. Everything rests naturally within itself. The mind rarely allows this. It often reaches beyond what is here, searching for improvement, searching for certainty, searching for completion. But standing quietly within a moment like this, those searches begin to lose their urgency, not because answers have appeared, because the questions themselves become softer. The lake continues moving gently beneath the light. The mountains remain silent in the distance. The sky stretches endlessly above them. Everything exists together. Nothing competes. Nothing resists. Nothing asks to become more. Breathing remains steady. The body remains at ease. Thoughts still arrive, but they no longer dominate the space around them. There is more room now, more openness, more silence between one thought and the next. The moment feels wider, not because the landscape has changed, because attention has stopped narrowing itself around every passing idea. The ripples continue, the sunlight remains. After a while, even the feeling of distance begins to soften. At first, the mountains seemed far away. Their peaks rose beyond the lake, separated by space, by perspective, by the simple fact that they existed elsewhere. The water stretched between here and there. The landscape appeared divided into parts. But gradually that feeling begins to change. The mountains remain where they are. The lake remains where it is. Nothing physically moves closer. Yet the sense of separation begins to disappear. The distance no longer feels important. The water belongs to the mountains. The mountains belong to the sky. The sky belongs to everything beneath it. Nothing exists alone. Everything participates in the same quiet presence. The ripples continue moving across the surface of the lake, soft movements carried by wind and water. None of them remain. None of them need to remain. Each ripple appears. Each ripple disappears. The lake loses nothing. The water remains. The mind begins to notice something familiar within this rhythm. Thoughts behave the same way. A memory appears. A concern appears. A plan appears. For a moment, each one seems important. For a moment, each one seems worthy of attention, but eventually they fade. Another thought arrives. Then another. Then another. The mind often acts as though every thought must be followed. Every thought must be understood. Every thought must become part of a larger story. Yet standing beside the lake, those assumptions begin to soften. The water does not follow every ripple. The lake does not attempt to preserve each movement. Everything arrives. Everything leaves. The stillness remains. The mountains continue resting beyond the water, ancient and unmoving. They do not appear concerned with passing moments. Clouds may come and go. Light may change. Seasons may arrive and disappear. Yet the mountains remain, not resisting change, simply existing within it. The sunlight continues resting across the landscape. Tiny reflections appear on the water, small flashes of brightness rising and fading almost immediately. Nothing holds them in place. Nothing asks them to stay. Their beauty exists precisely because they disappear. The mind notices this, and perhaps for the first time, disappearance no longer feels like loss. The wave that fades is not lost. The reflection that vanishes is not lost. The moment that passes is not lost. Everything simply changes form. Everything continues. Breathing remains steady. The body feels lighter now, not because anything has been solved, because nothing currently needs solving. The landscape offers no demands. The mountains ask for nothing. The lake asks for nothing. The sky asks for nothing. Everything exists exactly as it is. The mind often struggles with this simplicity. It searches for purpose, for conclusions, for certainty. But the landscape remains silent, and somehow the silence feels enough. Thought appears again, a memory from another place, another time, a version of life unfolding somewhere beyond this moment. For a few seconds, attention follows it. The story begins, the familiar movement of thinking, the familiar desire to continue. Yet the sound of the water remains. The openness of the sky remains. The presence of the mountains remains. And gradually the thought loses its weight. It fades naturally. No effort is required. The moment remains untouched. The lake continues moving softly beneath the light. The ripples spread across the surface, each one unique, each one temporary, none of them disturbing the larger stillness surrounding them. The same becomes true of thoughts. The same becomes true of emotions. The same becomes true of moments themselves. They arrive. They remain briefly. They disappear. The openness remains. Attention begins to widen. There is less focus on individual thoughts, less focus on individual concerns, more awareness of the larger space in which everything appears: the lake, the mountains, the sky, the thoughts, the memories, the passing sensations, everything appearing within the same open field of awareness. Nothing standing apart, nothing demanding ownership, nothing asking to become permanent. The sunlight shifts almost invisibly. The colors change slightly. The water darkens in some places and brightens in others. Yet the changes feel gentle, natural, expected. Nothing resists them. The mountains do not resist the light. The water does not resist the wind. The sky does not resist the passing hours. Everything participates willingly in change. The mind begins to trust this, not as an idea, as an experience. A direct recognition that life continues perfectly well without constant control. That moments unfold naturally. That peace appears most clearly when it is not being chased. The lake remains, the mountains remain, the sky remains. Gradually, even the feeling of stillness begins to change. At first, the calm seemed noticeable. The lake stretched quietly beneath the mountains. The ripples moved softly across the water. The distant peaks stood motionless beneath the open sky. Everything appeared peaceful. Everything appeared still. But over time, even the awareness of stillness begins to soften. The mind stops comparing the moment to anything else. It stops measuring how calm it feels. It stops noticing the quiet as something separate. The stillness remains, but it no longer feels like an experience. It simply feels natural. The water continues moving. The ripples spread gently across the surface. The sunlight shifts almost invisibly, yet nothing seems disturbed. Nothing feels interrupted. Movement and stillness no longer appear opposite to one another. They belong together. The lake moves. The mountains remain. The sky stretches endlessly above both. Everything participates in the same quiet rhythm. Thought appears again, a memory, a question, a faint image rising somewhere within awareness. For a moment, attention turns toward it. The familiar habit returns, the tendency to follow, the tendency to continue, the tendency to build one thought into another. But something has changed. The thought no longer feels as solid as it once did. It appears. It remains briefly, then begins to fade. without resistance, without effort. The moment remains untouched. The lake does not react. The mountains do not react. The sky remains exactly as it was. Everything continues. Breathing remains soft, steady, natural. There is nothing to manage, nothing to control. The body seems to understand this before the mind does. The water understands it too. The lake never attempts to stop its own movement. The mountains never attempt to preserve a particular moment of light. Everything allows change to happen. Everything continues naturally. The mind begins to trust this, slowly, quietly, without needing certainty. The sunlight continues reflecting across the water. Small flashes of brightness appear and disappear. Their presence feels effortless. Their disappearance feels effortless. Neither seems more important than the other. The mind often treats arrival and departure differently. It celebrates one, it fears the other. But the lake does not. The reflection appears. The reflection vanishes. Nothing is lost. The water remains. The same is true for thoughts. The same is true for emotions. The same is true for moments. Everything arrives. Everything leaves. The openness remains. Attention widens further. There is less interest in individual thoughts now, less interest in individual concerns. The larger space surrounding everything becomes easier to notice. The mountains rise in the distance. The lake rests beneath them. The sky stretches beyond both. Everything exists within the same open field. Nothing stands apart. Nothing asks for ownership. Nothing demands permanence. The ripples continue crossing the surface, each one different, each one temporary, none of them disturbing the larger stillness surrounding them. The same becomes true of experience itself. Thoughts move, sensations move, memories move. The deeper quiet remains, not because it resists movement, because it includes movement. The mountains remain unchanged. Their silence feels effortless. Their presence feels complete. They do not need recognition. They do not need explanation. They simply remain. There is comfort in this, not because the mountains provide answers, because they do not. They exist without needing justification. The lake exists without needing justification. The sky exists without needing justification. Perhaps life is closer to this than the mind often believes. Perhaps not everything requires a reason. Perhaps not everything requires understanding. The thought arrives softly, then settles. The moment continues. The sunlight shifts again. The reflections change. The water moves. Nothing becomes better. Nothing becomes worse. Everything simply changes. The mind begins to stop dividing experience into categories. Good, bad, success, failure, progress, delay. The landscape seems uninterested in such distinctions. The mountains do not compare themselves to the sky. The lake does not compare itself to the mountains. Everything belongs exactly where it is. Everything participates equally. The openness of the moment deepens, not because more has been added, because less is being resisted, less is being judged, less is being controlled. The need to improve the experience begins to fade. The need to reach beyond it begins to fade. Only the lake remains. Only the mountains remain. Only the sky remains. And somehow that feels enough. Thought appears once more. A final attempt to continue, to explain, to understand. Eventually, even the feeling that there is a journey taking place begins to fade. At first, it may have seemed as though the moment was leading somewhere. The lake, the mountains, The thoughts arriving and disappearing, the growing sense of quiet, everything appeared to be moving toward a deeper understanding, a clearer perspective, a destination hidden somewhere beyond the horizon. But now, even that feeling begins to soften. The moment no longer feels like part of a process. It no longer feels like a path. It simply exists. The lake remains beneath the sky. The mountains remain beyond the water. The light continues shifting slowly across the landscape. Nothing appears to be progressing. Nothing appears to be unfinished. Everything simply remains. The ripples continue crossing the surface. Small movements carried gently by wind and water. At first they seemed important. Something to notice. Something to follow. Now they are simply part of the landscape. No different from the mountains. No different from the sky. No different from the silence surrounding them. Everything belongs equally. Everything participates naturally. The mind becomes quieter. Not because thoughts have stopped appearing. Thought continues. A memory surfaces. A plan briefly forms. A question emerges somewhere in the background. Yet none of these movements feel urgent. They arrive. They remain. They disappear. The openness remains unchanged. The lake does not hold on to a ripple after it passes. The sky does not preserve a cloud after it moves on. The mountains do not collect the changing light of each passing day. Everything allows movement. Everything allows change. Nothing insists on permanence. The mind begins to trust this completely. There is less effort now, less reaching, less resistance. The need to improve the moment has almost disappeared. The need to understand the moment has almost disappeared. Only presence remains, simple, quiet, uncomplicated. The sunlight continues resting across the water. Tiny reflections appear and disappear across the surface. Their brightness lasts only seconds. Then they are gone. Yet nothing feels diminished. Nothing feels incomplete. The lake remains whole. The landscape remains whole. The moment remains whole. This completeness does not come from perfection. The water still moves. The light still changes. The wind still shifts across the surface. Everything remains temporary, yet nothing feels lacking. The mountains seem to reveal this naturally. They rise beyond the lake without effort. They ask for no recognition. They make no announcement of their presence. They simply remain. Their silence feels endless, not empty, not distant, just present. The kind of presence that asks for nothing. The kind of presence that allows everything. The mind begins to resemble this. Thought still appears, but it no longer dominates attention. Thought becomes part of the landscape, a ripple crossing water, a cloud crossing sky, a breeze moving through open air, temporary, natural, allowed. Nothing needs to be removed. Nothing needs to be added. Everything belongs. Breathing remains steady. The body feels light, not because something has changed, because nothing needs to change. The lake does not wish to become calmer. The mountains do not wish to become larger. The sky does not wish to become clearer. Everything already rests within itself. The mind finally begins to do the same. There is no destination beyond this moment, no hidden achievement waiting further ahead, no final understanding that must be reached. Only this, only the water, only the mountains, only the sky, only the quiet awareness in which all of it appears. The hours continue moving, the sunlight slowly changes, the shadows shift, yet the deeper stillness remains untouched. Not because it resists change, because it includes change. Everything moves within it. Everything belongs to it. Nothing exists outside of it. The lake continues, the mountains continue, the sky continues, the thoughts continue, the breathing continues. Everything appearing and disappearing within the same open space. The mind no longer feels separate from the landscape. The water is allowed to move. Thought is allowed to move. The mountains are allowed to remain. Silence is allowed to remain. Everything follows its own nature. Nothing is forced. Nothing is held. Nothing is resisted. This simplicity carries a quiet truth, not a philosophical truth, not an intellectual truth, something much simpler. The recognition that life is already happening before thought explains it. The lake does not need a description to exist. The mountains do not need meaning to exist. The sky does not need interpretation to exist. They are already here. The same may be true of this moment. The same may be true of yourself. Breathing continues softly.